People are still talking about today's decision by the grand jury not to charge the other officers at the scene of that deadly traffic stop.
The grand jury listened to all the evidence, voted on it, decided that the police officers were justified in their use of force that day.
A Texas grand jury decided not to indict two sheriff's deputies who were seen on a viral video fatally shooting a suspect in a domestic dispute. The suspect apparently had both hands in the air.
The grand jury did decide that these two Montgomery County deputies will not be indicted in the shooting death of Dante Martin.
Based on the evidence they heard and the law as it applies to police use of deadly force, the grand jury declined to bring criminal charges against Cleveland police officers Timothy Lohman and Frank Garmbeck.
A grand jury decided not to indict a Smyrna police officer who shot and killed an unarmed man back in March.
A Texas grand jury has cleared Planned Parenthood of misconduct regarding the alleged sale of fetal tissue, and instead has charged anti-abortion activists behind the secretly recorded videos with tampering with government records.
Of note, a decision by a grand jury in Texas not to indict anyone yet in connection with the death of an African-American woman while she was in custody.
A grand jury differs from a trial jury mainly because it's entirely run by the prosecution, and it is just determining whether or not criminal charges should be levied.
The process occurs in secret. The government presents witnesses to testify before the grand jury. The prosecutor explains the law to them and sort of pushes them in the direction he wants them to go in.
Here's the bottom line on grand jury process. The grand jury receives only information from the prosecuting attorney's office. So I always say the grand jury will do, or the grand jury decision, not verdict, the grand jury decision will reflect exactly what information that the prosecuting attorney gave them. The grand jury will do, 9 times out of 10, what the prosecutor asked for.
In many cases, a prosecutor who doesn't want to charge, there's public pressure, mounting pressure to charge a suspect with something, and the prosecutor, for whatever reason, doesn't want to. Okay, off to the grand jury. And we'll present evidence in such a way. I mean, they get what they want out of the grand jury as the standard operating. You've heard the old saw that you can indict a ham sandwich if the prosecutor wants, that the grand jury's just a rubber stamp. But by the same token, if a prosecutor doesn't want to indict, they can present the case to the grand jury, make it look like there's really nothing here. I know you're seeing things in the news and this, but this is all we've got. I'm going to leave it up to you. Do you get us a true bill or no true bill? That's an indictment or no indictment. Oftentimes, a prosecutor, when he wants no fingerprints on it, will go to the grand jury one way or the other for an indictment or not for one.
The grand jury do not form a committee to say, well, we want to send out these subpoenas and we want to see these people and we want to do that and that.
But they get to ask questions, though, of the witnesses that are brought in. Is that correct?
They can. They can. But a lot of that is still controlled by the prosecutor in the room.
The prosecutor investigates this, and she decides to present a case to a grand jury. We haven't seen the grand jury transcript yet, but we will. Not charging Planned Parenthood with selling body parts, but charging the journalists who were testing Planned Parenthood with participating in an actual conspiracy.
Law professor James Duane said the Planned Parenthood videos clearly show federal law was violated.
So it's really quite surprising that the grand jury would decide to indict not the folks who are behind all of this, but the investigators who are trying to bring this to light.
A prosecutor in the Harris County District Attorney's Office that has launched a criminal investigation into the Houston area Planned Parenthood has disclosed that she sits on the board of directors for the organization.
Lawyers are advocates, so in a grand jury room, you do not, and you've heard this, all the commentators, but I did many grand jury presentations as a federal prosecutor. No defense lawyer, no judge, no meaningful other side of the case. So here the question is, did the prosecutor somehow editorialize?
Sound like a political hit job, or
Absolutely,
what is this?
This is a political hit job. You used to practice law. I used to be on the bench. We both know that a skilled prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict anything. The favorite phrase is you can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich if you want.
There is also no judge and no defense attorney. The prosecutor basically just throws all possible evidence, witness accounts, and even hearsay testimony at a jury to see if, in the right conditions, a jury might decide that there was probable cause.
A grand jury in New York City has decided not to charge a white New York City police officer in the death of an unarmed African-American man.
My thoughts are that this ought to have been an indictment, and it ought to have been an indictment for some form of manslaughter. It's not first-degree murder, it's not second-degree murder, but it's certainly reckless manslaughter because of the excessive use of deadly force on a person who posed no serious or material threat to the police.
The Supreme Court, in a series of rulings as far back as the 1980s, gave the police a green light where it comes to telling them that the total decision-making about the use of deadly force came down to whether the officer's subjective belief is that he or another officer in safety is threatened. It's called objective reasonableness, and it is bastardized in every way you can imagine when it comes to these kinds of cases.
This is not a case like in Ferguson where there was a struggle for the gun and the police ended up with the gun rather than the other person. This is a case of a poor, sorry individual doing nothing more than selling untaxed cigarettes, and as a result of government intervention, he's dead.
A grand jury system in a cop killing setting like this fails in so many ways. The inherent conflict of interest issues are overwhelming. The legal infrastructure in place from the very beginning is so protective of policemen.
Prosecutors don't give defendants an opportunity to tell their story, ever. You will answer the question that I ask you, and then the jury will piece together everything that needs to be made, because it all depends on who's asking the questions.
The officers who testify in these places, they're rarely confronted with any kind of serious cross-examination. What parades through the grand jury, Abby, are forensic experts that are highly paid. They're all self-assured. They're not cross-examined. But when you put those same experts in the courtroom, as I have so many times, and you have the opportunity to cross-examine them and get to the truth of what they're saying, they fall apart. That doesn't happen back there in the grand jury room where you have the police-friendly expert that passes without challenge.
These decisions are also controversial because grand juries usually choose to indict. Reports have said that 99% of all cases that go before a federal grand jury end with the prosecution taking the case to criminal trial, and so do the majority of state grand juries. There's a famous quote from a former chief judge of New York that grand juries will indict a ham sandwich if the prosecution wants them to. However, the statistics also show that grand juries rarely indict a police officer. An investigation by the Houston Chronicle found that police have been nearly immune from criminal charges in shootings in large cities.
Norm Stamper, former chief of the Seattle Police Department. Your perspective on this relationship between police and prosecutors in situations like this?
It's a difficult relationship. It is one that is fraught with contradiction and all manner of politics. Police officers and prosecutors must work effectively together to help prepare and prosecute cases where you have criminal defendants. Prosecutor, of course, making a decision whether or not you have a criminal defendant in the first place. But when it comes to an in-custody death, when it comes to a police officer taking the life of another, these two factions that have to work together day by day by day may in fact find themselves on opposite ends of the argument. And I think that argues for a major structural change in our criminal justice system.
Prosecutor's most effective approach to letting the policeman walk, like we saw here, is by overwhelming his friends on the jury with complex, choreographed presentations that provide zero cohesiveness, zero direction on substantiating an indictment at all.
No crime, no trial, all harm, no foul.